Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Coach's Corner. Today I'm joined by Tony Montgomery. Tony, how you doing?
Doing good. Survived the alligator attack, apparently, that you've portrayed online, and people were very worried and concerned. But I'm here in Florida, surviving the onslaught of the alligators and pythons and iguanas that have saturated the land.
So when you told me that you hurt your ribs, I immediately had two thoughts. I was like, he either hurt it in an admirable manner doing jujitsu, or he fell off his bike and doesn't want to tell anyone that he fell off his bike and hurt himself. So like, I'm just going to make up something ridiculous. And yeah, it worked out well. I think it got us a few more views.
It did. It did. If I can, sacrifice my life for that, it's well worth it. But yeah, it was jujitsu related. I was having trouble capturing my breath. If anything that was overly exertive, I was just having a really hard time. And I was waking up a couple times in the middle of the night with like an excruciating back pain that was just kind of like pulling on all my rhomboid musculature and traps. And it was just making it really hard to breathe. And I thought maybe I fractured a rib or did something along those lines. But turns out just some bruising. And I have to do these breath drills throughout the day with like long inhales to a certain extent and then hold. And then that should start to help heal the process. It's like the floating ribs. So it's like, it's called something, but it's just, yeah. So it's kind of like the floating ribs keep going in and out. And so it's about trying to get the diaphragm to get stronger and the lungs to get stronger to keep it pushed out, which will benefit me in the long run. But it's just, I've been having issues with like rolling and sparring and just finding being in positions where like I normally don't have issues with cardio, and I would get into these issues. And then it was just like 5 minutes later, I was almost having a panic attack because I couldn't catch my breath. So
I've injured my ribs once. I broke a rib snowboarding. I had to like walk around with my hand behind my back for like a month.
Why? What did you do?
Because it's the only position that I could be in that it didn't hurt my ribs.
Yeah.
I was also super young and I didn't like do anything.
No, yeah. So all good. VA got in, got out. And
Perfect.
I was happy with it all, but missed a good podcast you and Trevor Cashy did. It was awesome.
Really interesting podcast. I was surprised when I originally like reached out to him. I thought it would be a really big X's and O's podcast, and it was absolutely not that. So that was an interesting one.
When you're dealing with like a genius, you would expect it to be purely X's and O's, but he definitely did a great job of, you're not the genius that Trevor is, just so you know, just so we're clear.
I'm well aware.
Yeah. He graduated college at 17. So
his PhD at 22.
Yeah. In biochemistry. But yeah, it was really good. I love the communication aspect, and that seems to be like a common trend. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit today as well, but being able to communicate with your athletes and get on their level and make sure you guys you're not over talking them, or you're not over presenting things, and you're not overwhelming them with a bunch of nonsense that just doesn't really make sense to them. So you always want to make sure that you're meeting them where they're at, as difficult as that may be. I know some people, and we talked about this a little bit before we jumped on, have this resignation to dumb things down, so to speak, right? They always will talk in a certain intellectual manner because they feel like if you can't keep up, that's a you thing, not a them thing. And I feel like that's such a horrible way to disseminate information that you've taken years and years to learn, because those are the people that need it the most, are the ones that don't have that same knowledge base. So being able to communicate them with them is vitally important.
For sure.
So today we have Victoria Felkar.
You're going to ask me how I'm doing?
Oh, no, not really. I saw you miss some squats. So I didn't want to bring it up, but sure. How are you doing? I didn't want to pour salt in the wound.
Honestly, it was so stupid, but one of a return to my younger years, I would say. No, I'm good, man. I'm at a point in prep where everything's going very well. Very close to like all-time numbers, but then I had the setback with my shoulder, like very fluke, like unracked 600 pounds, which should be like a third to last warm-up for me, and just felt a crack in my like posterior shoulder. It's improving every day, so I should be back to like competition squats in a couple weeks, probably after this week. But yeah, I just bit off more than I could chew this week. The one thing that I thought is cool. It's like, so I've been experimenting with protein overfeeding, and it's to the point now as you go through prep and things get changed where I have a very low appetite, and I actually had to bring it down because I could not eat. It's like my appetite's so low with all the protein.
Okay, so it's just a protein thing.
Well, it's other stuff as well,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Have you noticed a decrease in recovery or body composition by lowering it?
Not yet. It just this week I lowered it, but
Okay.
I only lowered it like 25 grams. But yeah, I just couldn't believe how quickly the drop in appetite happened.
You know what you're supposed to do when that happens, right? Is you just take more drugs to increase your appetite. You
More
just
drugs
use
makes my
drugs.
appetite lower though.
No, you use the drugs that increase your appetite. Like you get some growth hormone.
I already take that.
You do some insulin, so that way you have to force feed yourself or you die. You take GHRP6. You know, you just do that.
I think that's a terrific segue into our conversation with our guest. We're joined by Victoria Felkar today. As we said before the podcast, Victoria is doing some things within the science community and the fitness community that not many people are able to do, and bridging the gap between them, mainly with hormones, drug use, and I would say specifically the female athlete. Victoria, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
After that last comment, I kind of want to like crawl under my desk, but I know it was joking. So at least with you two, it's joking. Maybe not for other people in the industry, but I'm doing well. Thank you. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's one of the biggest things and biggest issues that I see within the industry when it comes to the abuse of drugs is they use drugs to combat the side effects of drugs instead of just reducing the drugs that they're taking, which maybe we'll get into, maybe we won't, but I think that's
full disclosure. That's exactly what I did. I took out drugs.
Yeah, that helps a lot for sure. You know,
it's much easier.
That's medicine though too.
Yeah.
It's this lovely thing called polypharmacy, and but there's ways around it, which we'll probably talk about.
Yes, for sure. For sure.
Can you kind of give a little bit of background and insight into what your current research is that you're doing and what you're working on, so people can get kind of an idea of where you're coming from in terms of your knowledge base and stuff like that?
I sure can. So I'm an interdisciplinary researcher. With a frog in my throat at the moment.
That's how it always happens when as soon as you start or you have to talk, it's immediately something's going on.
I'm out of practice. That's, I think, the thing. This is like second podcast in I think a year, which is weird for me. But so I'm an interdisciplinary researcher. The easiest way to situate what I do is it's in sport medicine. So I despise that term, but I also love that term because it's really easy to describe what I do, because I literally sit between sport and medicine. Right. And by sport, I look at the athlete body in particular. And although my work does focus more on women, we're at the end of the day, there are some common denominators, no matter what sex you are, that really don't get looked at the ways in which they should, with regards to performance, health, and drugs, hormones, and where that knowledge actually comes from. So my specific dissertation subject for my doctoral research is on female steroid use, and the term steroid I use broadly. So often, especially within the strength community, steroid gets associated with anabolic androgenic steroids. There are actually a lot of different types of molecules that are called steroids. I look at those that are typically associated with reproduction. So estrogens, progesterones, and androgens, and their use within the female athlete population.
Very cool. I think Tony and I are going to be very much approaching this conversation as students. I personally am very interested in the topic, because I don't think it gets its due diligence, right? We talk about, I added this, I took this is the PED, I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of this. And when we're dealing with, especially, the female reproductive system, it's very delicate. I think people take too many liberties with it in general, just mainly because of a lack of understanding. There's one, I wanted to actually start the conversation on birth control, because I think as athletes, it's a really, and as coaches of female athletes, it's funny. I always ask, because I'm comfortable asking. I've worked with female athletes for like 15 years. Are you on birth control? Do you get a regular period? The amount of coaches that I've spoken to that have no idea if their clients are on birth control is astounding to me, because you're missing out on a lot of data. And the one question I did want to start off is, like, if a client is on birth control, I know of a number of people who will avoid that week of bleeding and just continue on their birth control. Could you talk about, and I've heard doctors say it's not required. So can you go into that a little bit?
Beautiful segue from my dissertation, because I talk all about that.
Perfect.
So let's back up just a microsecond.
Yep.
So we should be asking our female athletes if they have an ovulatory menstrual cycle. A bleed is only a small piece of menstruation for women. And all too often, even women themselves, because this is one of my questionnaires when I work with women with consulting, is, do you have an ovulatory menstrual cycle? And a lot of women actually don't know what that is, and don't know how that contributes to their reproductive cycle, or even just their general health. And so women can bleed for multiple different hormone situations and also other biochemical situations. A bleed does not equate to what's called ovulation. Ovulation is, I guess the fastest and shortest way I can explain it, is when a woman creates the hormone progesterone through the ebb and flow of, I would really say, physiological balance, meaning that in order for a woman to ovulate, the body really has to be in check. Ovulation is very sensitive to stress situations, no matter if that's external stress or internal stress, such as, let's say, anemia, or vitamin deficiencies in B12 or B9, or sleep deprivation, including, psychological emotions, things like that as well. So ovulation is really critical, because without it, we don't create most of the progesterone in the body. And that progesterone and estrogen are like yin and yang when it comes to reproduction. Women can only have so many what's called an anovulatory cycle, which is a bleed without ovulation, before their hormones get very, very, very skewed, meaning that the estrogen usually goes up in the absence of progesterone. And then your gonadotropins, which are FSH and LH, also begin to shift, and levels will change. Really depends on kind of the underlying reason why somebody's not ovulating. But long story short, if you don't ovulate regularly, bad things are going to happen to your like hormonal milieu or your balance, your set point. And so that's one of the really important things for us to ask athletes, and also to really be more, and obviously I don't want to go into my huge tangent of teaching about what ovulation is and how do we, understand it more. But the reason why it's important is that progesterone, not only is it essential to health in the body, it also, though, is really, really important to be able to keep our other hormones in check, as well as, for athletes, it's one of the things that does get shifted. And you see high levels of anovulatory cycles in female athletes simply because of the stress that we put on the body. Yeah. Performance at the end of the day is stress. And it's so funny because I ask, high, like Olympic level athletes, like, well, are you stressed? No. I'm like, no, right. No. Okay, let's say that again. Are you stressed? Did you practice today? Are you doing 2-a-days? Do you have a competition? What's your periodization cycle? There is no concept in the athletic domain as to what actually sport is doing to them. It's almost this taken for granted aspect of that. Oh yeah, I go and I perform and I'm like, okay, let's break it down. You're literally causing physiological destruction and then hoping you have the resources to build yourself back up again. And not all of us have the resources to build ourselves back up again efficiently, effectively, or it takes a little bit more. And some of us, the stress, like that physiological destruction, is magnified compared to, say, somebody else who's matched for the activity we're doing in age and sex. There's a lot of variables that go into that. And so with women in particular, their reproductive cycles, they are very sensitive to stress. Not all women's. And the more that I do my research and the more that I act as a practitioner in this field, one of the things I've realized is that women who can continue to maintain ovulation, even in high stress athletic states, usually are the mutants. Yeah. They're usually the ones that are light years beyond the pack. Which, ask me in maybe 10 years when I can actually get the research on this and start pursuing that, because I think there is something to that. Yeah. I think that there is something, if we even just think about what progesterone does in the female body in terms of the metabolism, in terms of the nervous system, which is something that I feel is severely under discussed in sports right now, and the impact of things like the neurotransmitter GABA or powerlifters. It's like a warm blanket after you've just demolished yourself doing a high neuro stress activity. You can only do that for so long until things start to break down. Now, Paul, going back to your question about birth control. So birth control, there's lots of different types of it. That's another big misperception that people have, is that, it's the birth control pill. And I'm like, oh, no. Right. We have the pill, we have the patch, we have the IUD that's hormonal, and we also have a non-hormonal IUD. We have a shot, we have an implant, we have a vaginal ring. There are lots of different types. Not only that, each of these have their own breakdown of particular ratios and types of hormones used. Not all birth control contains, or hormonal birth control contains both estrogen and a progesterone. So a progesterone is a synthetic derivative of either testosterone or progesterone that acts like progesterone in some of the progesterone receptors in the body, but not all. And it's a lot stronger. It's about 400 times as strong as the natural progesterone in our reproductive axes. And so some birth control is progesterone only. That's like called the mini pill, for example, or the Mirena IUD. Some birth control has a high level of a synthetic estrogen and a moderate level of, let's say, a progesterone derivative progesterone. Some birth control has a high level of a progesterone that's been derived from an androgen. And this all is important when we talk about strength athletes, and I'll get into that in a second. And some might have a lower level of synthetic estrogen. So why this is important is that the type of birth control influences how that drug acts in the body. It would be no different, and I'm sure that maybe some of your listeners know a little bit about anabolic androgenic steroids. That's an assumption that I have.
It's a safe assumption.
Safe, yeah.
But it would be like me saying, Paul, you're on androgens, and assuming that whatever you're taking, whether it's Tren or Anavar, it's the same thing in the body. Oof. Right? Right. And hopefully we can pick up on the nuance that it's not the same thing in the body. It's acting very differently. Same thing with synthetic estrogens and progesterones. Same thing if you were taking, let's say, 25 milligrams of Tren versus 500. They're going to do very different things in the body. Right. And so certain types of progesterones do, especially where they're like if they're derived from a progesterone or a testosterone, will have different implications for the user when they're on, as well as the process of coming off and being off.
Interesting.
And there has been shitty research done in this, and I can say that as, I guess, an authority on this area,
Right.
but that often studies pursuing the effects of birth control on female athleticism or performance don't actually distinguish between different types of birth control.
Yeah.
They don't distinguish between
What?
how long a user has been on. They don't distinguish in female athletes who are not, so the control of female athletes who are not on birth control, whether or not they have an ovulatory cycle or not. So the research is, I mean, it's shit.
It seems like that'd be a lot of holes.
It is awful. There are very few studies that I can stand behind that have been done since 1919 was one of the first ones. And then it really wasn't until 1945, 1950. And then you see this spike in the 1960s and 70s of research looking at performance, menstruation, because that's really when sports science was building and getting very popular. But before that, it really wasn't talked about. It wasn't studied. And then, I mean, into the 1990s, there was a spike. In the last 5 years, there's been another spike. But the last 5 years, the research is just as bad as it was 25, 30 years ago. There are certain variables that just don't get controlled for. So when somebody comes to me and goes like, okay, Victoria, what's the effect of birth control on performance? I'm like, I can postulate.
Yeah.
Right.
But there really isn't data on that. And for somebody to be able to make large, sweeping, generalized statements, I still don't understand. I'm like, does that person have data that I don't? Like, I'm pretty sure after 6 years, I've probably dug to like the core of this earth to find all the research I possibly can. Like learning how to speak Russian and German to analyze research that was done. Like, I have not found very good research on it. So
that's pretty disheartening.
Massively. Think about how good female athletes could potentially be in terms of setting and going beyond world records if we actually had the data to support their performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Think of that. It's massive. So I just went on a tangent. I apologize. Please stop me at any time if I do that again. But that's birth control. So I guess going back to just one of the things, let me just kind of scoot back around here for a second. The main object of many forms of hormonal birth control is to stop you from ovulating.
Right.
It's to castrate you chemically.
Mm-hmm.
Some forms of birth control, such as the hormonal IUD, do promote that women will still ovulate, but there's a lot of factors that are involved with that, such as the fact that when you first get the IUD, so it's like a long-acting release. When you first get that IUD, you're going to have way more hormones pumping through your body than at year 3 or year 4.
Right.
And so you may have more of a chance to ovulate when you're in that year 3, year 4 than you will in that first year. Not only that, it's not like those hormones just stay in the uterus and there's no other implications. That is another massive fallacy. And so when we talk about women being on the pill, yes, they're able to control, so gain menstrual cycle control, AKA make it completely stop bleeding, make it bleed be a shorter duration between cycles for performance, or extend it, so longer duration between bleeds. But that bleed is an anovulatory bleed. It is a withdrawal from having a low hormone environment. So the birth control pill, it's typically 3 weeks of active hormone, 1 week of a sugar pill. Right. So if I were to say to you right now, and I'm sorry to pick on you, Paul, because I don't know enough about Tony's background with all this stuff.
It's really easy, yeah.
But you've already been very candid about certain things that you're on right now. But if you were just to stop taking all the PEDs that you're on, let's say that are androgen family, what would happen over the next 7 days? You'd feel like shit.
Yeah.
You would crash.
I'd feel like Tony.
But you would crash, and that's what that withdrawal is. That's that week of the quote bleed. It's your endometrium having almost this stress response and sloughing as a result of that. It's not hormonally induced in the way that an ovulatory bleed is.
Right.
So when women do begin to, fidget and control their cycles, there are some downsides to that, because you can start to get like a thickened endometrium, which that is where you start to get abnormal cells. And it's really important for things like cervical cancer to make sure that that is not occurring. It's also important to recognize that women really should not be on birth control long term. A lot of the original studies actually suggested about 5 to 7 years max. I've had recently, I would say in the last 2 months of consulting, I've had somebody on birth control for 25 years, 32 years, and 37 years.
Yeah.
So
Doesn't surprise me in the least, but
yeah.
I get where you're coming from. So from my understanding, in terms of the bleed itself, because it's anovulatory, there's no true hormonal trigger. It's simply a stress response from that hormone replacement being removed. And then the drawbacks would be maybe an increased risk of cervical cancer, maybe an increased risk of thickening endometrium and possibly abnormal cells.
Yeah, there are some benefits though to it as well.
The control of your cycle would for sure be a benefit.
And stability.
Okay.
Right? You're not giving yourself the boom. When women have, for example, menstrual related migraines, and this is a very tricky topic because they actually say don't go on birth control when you have menstrual related migraines, but they'll still use something like the mini pill, which is a progesterone only pill. They will run it straight through to ensure that somebody is not getting the highs and the lows, because it's the highs and the lows that will trigger typically a menstrual related migraine. So you do get that flatlining of hormones, but women, and actually men for that matter, are supposed to have variation to their hormones.
Right.
The rest of the body needs that. The brain, the digestion, the metabolism. We are supposed to have highs and lows. We're not supposed to be flatlined.
Now, beyond birth control and beyond the pill, is there ways that females can stabilize their hormones with nutrition and vitamins and supplements and things beyond that, if they're looking for other ways to counteract that and create stability within their own plan and paradigm?
Yeah. Some of the most interesting research that I have been writing on now for a long time, I'd have to say is just the general perceptions that we have of menstruation. So menstruation has been positioned like diabolically just opposed to performance. It is the worst thing you can possibly have for performance, and that is a myth.
Yeah,
that is such a myth, because in the 50s, well, I would say 40s, 50s, 60s, there was a lot of really interesting research that was done on Olympic female athletes, and showing that, hey, these were all Olympic athletes that set records or that had their best performances at elite competitions while they were on their cycle. They were ones that their coaches literally programmed them to think your menstruation does not impact your performance. If we go back even further in time, women were not allowed to compete during menstruation because it was perceived to be dangerous for their health.
Yeah.
And this was based off of just myths and misperceptions and stereotypes around menstruation and the female body. You've got to remember that women weren't allowed to participate in sport until like 1900s. It was getting a little bit more popular. We really weren't even allowed to run the full marathon until the 1980s. Ski jumping,
80s?
It's crazy.
The 80s, ski jumping, women were not allowed to do it in 2010 because it was believed that their uterus would get impacted on landing. The myths and misperceptions about women's reproductive health in sport, in medicine, but in sport in particular, are rampant. And those have created policies. Those have created practice and guidelines. And those have created also certain types of prescribing guidelines when it comes to the use of things like birth control. estrogen was the first, quote, steroid that was used in sport in 1934 was the study that was completed, published in 1935. And it was to control female swimmers' cycles because, well, in the late 1920s, they were slowly starting to shift ideas and women were starting to be able to compete during their menstruation. Swimming was still off limits because of ideas around menstrual blood being dirty and contaminant, as well as ideas of what jumping into the pool would do and the cold water. And so it was this kind of this whole kaleidoscope of myths that created a practice of controlling menstruation for sport. And that's still something that's done today. So, Tony, going back to your question, are there other ways to stabilize it? Yeah, there are. But the biggest thing is menstruation should not be painful. It should not take away your life. It should not be this awful event that happens. And if it is, that's a signal that something's not going the way it should.
Right.
Something's not right. We need to figure out what that is and isolate it, not just paint these practices over top of it and pretend that everything's okay. I mean, for example, anemia, both B12, B9, and then also iron-based will contribute to dysmenorrhea or more painful periods. It will lead to more heavy bleeding. That's relatively easy to work with. Things such as, I mean, chronic anovulation, that will also lead to issues. If we can think about just the fundamental foundations that all athletes, men and women alike, should be doing and reinforce those, that is a beautiful first step.
Yeah.
Because I mean, from what I've seen within the literature, and although you said it's very shoddy, it seems like a lot of these high-level athletes also have low energy availability, and that's what creates a lot of the deficiencies with female hormones. That triad, right, where it's a deficiency in nutrients, a deficiency in calories, and then that leads to the continued flux of hormones. Am I right in that, or am I wrong in that? Okay. So good. That's why we have you on.
Yeah. I'm like the honey badger devil's advocate when it comes to all this work, because the female triad is it's a disease that's been created by sport for sport. That's rather bad science when you think about it.
For sure.
Somebody outside of sport cannot have the female triad. Really?
Yeah, it makes no sense, right?
It doesn't make any sense. Yeah. And that a lot of that whole world around the triad, and now it's called REDS, or relative energy deficiency syndrome. Let's replace energy and put recovery.
Okay.
Or let's replace energy and start talking about that all cause stress. We have to, and I think I've talked about this in a lot of talks that I've done the last couple of years, but often when we think about health and performance, they're on either end, or people think that they can balance them. And I always give that metaphor of the teeter-totter. I don't know about you two, but I've never seen a teeter-totter that has been suspended perfectly aligned.
Yeah, it doesn't happen.
Even if you have two people that are the same weight and the same height, I mean, we could twin study this and we still wouldn't. There are
it would still teeter. It would still go back
exactly,
and forth just a
there's
little bit.
other forces at play than just the weight, just the health and the performance. And so every athlete is going to go through times that performance is going to take precedent and health is going to take precedent. But if you try to balance, you only do a disservice to your athletes, because then both their performance and their health are not going to be as optimal as they could be. I think that it's completely let me rephrase this. For some female athletes, it is probably idiopathic or normal for them to lose their menstrual cycle, let's say the month before a meet. Why? Volume's gone up. Let's say they've had to make a weight cut. Let's say they've also got higher just psychological stress about the meet itself. Is there anything pathological about that? No.
Right.
What's you get into problem when it's 3 months after the meet and they still haven't had their cycle return.
Yeah.
Right.
Now we take away the weight cut. Let's talk about just doing a high volume program. And let's say they're still eating enough, but they're first year university, they're full course load, they're working, they're trying to have a social life, their sleep is maybe 3-4 hours a night.
Right.
Is that relative energy deficiency? Well, sure, energy in terms of like their actual energy to do life, but is that the definition that gets used in literature? No.
No, yeah, not at all.
Not at all. Body composition does not equate to menstrual status. It is a contributing variable, but it should not be the only thing we look at, because if we only look at that, we fail to see everything else. And that's one of my, like, the things that grind my gear about the literature is that they became so fixated on body type. And believe it or not, that came out of the ridiculous, awful eugenics research that was completed in the 1920s and the 1930s that led to World War II.
Yeah.
We have clung, like literally continued to cling on to that. My master's I did on body typing theories because my mind was like, these don't make sense. Where did they come from? And when I started to get into that and ideas around profiling, it's disturbing when we start to apply then that to a medical rubric for diagnosing things. There are lots of individuals and athletes that are not what you would consider to be in a starved, quote, state. Right. Because the starved state they've associated with body composition levels. Well, I've had many individuals, I've worked with them myself included, that I didn't look like I was in a starved state, but let me tell you, I was not eating. I was in a starved state. I've also had individuals that were well-fed, that had beyond healthy levels of body composition that have been regular. I've had some that have not been regular in terms of ovulation. I have some that have never ovulated. I have some that have, I mean, they are fertile myrtle. They know their 28-day perfect, like stereotypical cycle. So there's just so much individual variance and variety that when we talk about these subjects, we have to be careful with that. It's like those whole, the hogwash around like everybody should squat ass to grass with the same foot distance. And it's like, well, no, we're not clones. We're all different.
Would there be any like, sorry to hijack, would there be any like general, we'll say guidelines on things to look for or like warning signs? Because for me, probably the number one thing that I hear from female clients when they start working with me on their nutrition is, oh, I'm so much more regular. I don't have as bad of cramps, and like all of these, my bleeds aren't as heavy. And it's generally because of the things that I try to espouse to them in terms of, okay, we're going to eat enough calories. We're going to, practice some stress management techniques. We're going to eat some red meat and some whole eggs. Fruits and vegetables are the focus. And it's just things that they may not have been doing before. And then on top of the restriction habits that they were doing. But I find for me, just stress management, making some modifications to food choices can have quite a profound impact. Is there anything else that you try to recommend to women who want a little bit more control over their cycles?
All athletes.
Yeah, exactly.
Be a good human. I mean, there's those fundamentals that I think athletes are like, I don't need to do that. And I'm like, you need to have social engagement with human beings, not with computers or devices. I sound like I'm like 80, but you've got to talk to people. You've got to have healthy social relationships and also a healthy relationship with yourself. There's amazing research, and Tony, kind of going to your thing about the triad, there's been research that's shown that women with simply negative self-body image, not dieting behaviors, not over exercising, just simply having a perception of negative body image, are prone to anovulatory cycles.
Yeah. That's wild.
So having a positive relationship with yourself is really important.
Yeah.
I mean, even things such as being able to manage your athletic training load in terms of if you are a strength athlete and your nervous system is jacked up, well, you got to actually do things to bring yourself down, like breathing.
Right.
You know, we can last a long time without food, we can last a long time without water, but we can't last very long without breath. And a lot of athletes are really shitty at breathing because we're so bloody tight all the time. I mean, pelvic floor work in women is incredibly important. And I'm not talking about Kegels. A lot of athletes, female athletes, are what's called hypertonic pelvic floor. That has implications for how you're able to diaphragmic breathe. That has implications for how you're able to actually have bowel movements. It has implications for cramping. And so the way that I look at how do we create like the healthiest athlete we can, we have to look at things inside the body and we have to look at things outside the body. If you have a high stress life, does that mean that you should be doing a high stress training program simultaneously?
Probably not.
Or do you need to try that much harder with basic management principles?
Right.
Right? Getting to bed on time, making sure you're having good sleep. If you have any sleep disturbances, whether we're talking about TMJ or sleep apnea, you've got to get on top of those. You've got to get something in the work to help with that. Being able to have regular, like I almost look at my little checkpoints of like, how is your digestion? And not only in terms of bloating or constipation, but even just like, do you feel good after you eat? Or do you kind of feel slow, like your digestion just feels heavy? Okay, let's work on that. How is your skin, your hair, your nails? Those all give us clues to how, quote, some healthy somebody is, that go beyond just like, what's your menstrual status? Are you having PMS? If so, what are some potential underlying reasons for that? And now there's so much to this. Like it's just this giant ball of yarn, because people can have menstrual issues simply because of trauma.
Right.
It's like, we got to deal with our shit. We all do, though. How do you make good athletes? If we stop focusing on performance and start focusing on recovery, guess what? They're going to perform better. But we put so much emphasis on the end, not on the actual process. And that's something that's only really come from the American paradigm of performance. If you look at other paradigms of performance, like pre-1940s, it was about recovery. It was about how do we support our athletes to recover, because we know they know how to swim, they know how to deadlift, they know how to run. And they're really damn good at it. So instead of us focusing so hard on that, let's look at how can we support them recovering, because if they recover, they're going to continue to climb.
Yeah.
And I see the same thing with women and their cycle. We have to treat that the same way.
Yeah. Which that brings me to the question I was going to ask before Paul rudely interrupted me, was when you're focusing on these things, right, and you have the health dynamic in place, how often should you push athletes to be at a high level of performance, right? Because we see so often that athletes, especially within the realm of PEDs and any type of hormone augmentation, is that they rely so heavily on these things that if they compete 4 times a year, well, then there's never really a point where they're actually focusing on their health. So if recovery is the key to keeping people healthy, how long should periods of high performance be? And then subsequent, how long should they be in high recovery modes? Almost like the same thing that you would get asked if someone did their first cycle of PEDs, like I'm on for 8 weeks. How many weeks should I be off? What's my post-cycle therapy look like? Like we don't ever think of that in terms of, especially with women, like men, they'll get off and they'll get their blood work done if they're doing things right, and they'll cruise or they'll try to get their PCT. Women, it's just like, I just stopped and that was it. And it's like, well, there has to be more to it than just stopping, right?
That's
so so
to sleep.
So if you have the sleep in place, if you have the things in place, and it's like, okay, these next 3 months, maybe we have to cut down to the next weight class and be ready to perform at a high level. How much ebb and flow should you have throughout the year of being a high performer versus recovery?
I don't have an answer, because some people shouldn't be high performance athletes.
What would be indicative of you telling someone that? Because I've told people several times that, hey,
Yeah.
this maybe not, I've worked with you for 2 years and we've, maybe this isn't a sport for you.
You have, let's just give a little vignette or a little case study here. You have a 23-year-old female who has had an irregular cycle since she went through puberty. She was put on the pill at 14, went off at 20, still has not had any sign of a healthy ovulatory cycle. She has a really hard time losing weight, losing body fat. She has issues with sleep, is also going to, let's say, final year of university, working, and says, hey, I want to do a meet and I want to get down to this weight class. What do you do?
Probably not the best choice.
Yeah, there's a lot of communication that goes into that.
Yeah.
Right. What do you do? I look at a case like that and I go like, not everybody has what it takes. And I say this because that's me. So I say this with the utmost respect, because that's a really hard pill to swallow. And I chased it for so many years before I finally had to say, like, I just don't have what it takes.
Yeah.
Financials is one piece of it. And I always bring that up because it's really important that somebody's not putting themselves in complete debt and stress to be able to afford to be a high performance athlete, because it ain't cheap. It is not cheap to actually do what you should be doing in terms of recovery modalities and food and training and sleep and recovery. It is not cheap. So if you can't do it, you wait until you can.
Yeah.
And
No, go ahead.
So other things that also are influencing here. I mean, we have to talk about things like pre-existing stress. We have to talk about stress over the course of a life course itself too. So I always look at individuals, and I have a model for this that I usually apply, because I mean, we have an athlete here in time, but we also have to look at where they were ahead or where they were behind. Sorry. So what were the years that led to today, and what are the years forward? When women come to me and say, hey, I want to still be fertile, and I'm like, the path you're on right now does not align with that goal.
Right.
And that's often why I'll have individuals that I work with identify more than performance goals.
Yeah.
If they want to start a family in the next 5 years, if they want to make it to the next, say, corporate level, if they want to travel, I have to sit down and I have that hard conversation and go like, okay, not only do we not have the physiological foundation in place, we also have to look at your current set of goals and see that they don't necessarily all work together. So yes, getting you in good shape for you is attainable, but getting you to a high performance state might not be with those other goals. It doesn't mean you can't do it.
Yeah.
It just is going to take a lot to get there. And I have to really question if you are going to want to sacrifice or even have the resources available to get there, to sustain it and to maintain it.
That's exactly that was where I was going with my question. It's like, we do our best to educate the individual on, we can get you to a meet, we can get you to compete, and you might be at your best, but with the additional goals that you set forth of dropping a weight class, maybe you want to break certain records or whatever that would require, we'll call them certain health sacrifices. It's like, does that align with your values as a person long term?
Yeah.
And I had to have that conversation with a client recently, within the last 2 weeks. It's like, okay, you want to use PEDs. That's fine. You want to do it. Do you know how they work? Do you know the potential side effects?
Yeah.
Do you know how to deal with these side effects? Again, do you want to have kids in the near future? All of these things need to be weighed. Ultimately, it's their decision what they do with their body. It's not like, I'm not going to tell someone what to do. I'll do my best in most situations to guide them towards the healthiest way to do things. But there have even been positions I've been put in, more so with men than with women, where I'm just like, yo, I'm not going to help you do that to yourself.
Yeah.
And I think the way we communicate with our clients, empower them with information.
Yeah.
We should never make decisions for them.
And I worked with some of the best female athletes in the strength community, bodybuilding, powerlifting, strong women, all that jazz and more. I have worked with entry level. I do not care if you're on the top of the world or if you've never competed. I will give you the same pep talk about this, because at the end of the day, who you are today is not who you want to be tomorrow. And it is a really difficult conversation to have when the knowledge about the implications or even what foundation should be in place isn't there. So like when it comes to birth control, for example, when the age of onset of when you started the pill or a hormonal contraceptive has an impact on long-term side effects. How long you were on it has an impact for long-term side effects. If somebody, and again, another little case study here, if somebody's 32 years old and says to me, say they're a national level competitor, let's say top 5, they're a good national level competitor. And they come to me and they say, okay, I want to take it to the next level. They were, let's say, on birth control until the previous year, 31 years old. And I go, okay, so you're 32. You've also identified to me previously you want to have kids in the next 3 years. Women after 37, about 37 to 41, perimenopause has started. They're on a train now. Being on the pill, she's going to probably have some egg preservation, but you still, certain individuals, they're going to begin to have swings to their FSH, LH levels, as well as DHEA, estradiol, that type of thing. So I go, okay, so we got 3 years here. Now you were on the pill, okay, for how long? Most of your adult reproductive life. That means you have not made progesterone for most of your adult reproductive life. Okay, bone status, metabolism status, GABA status. I start to go down that checklist. So even though they're a damn good competitor, I have to tell them like, hey, there's going to be implications if we don't have your cycle regular before you compete next. There's going to be implications if that cycle goes away for more than 3 months, a year for the next 3 years.
Yeah.
There's going to be implications if you continue to say utilize certain PEDs. You might not think there is now because everything seems like hunky-dory, but that storm is coming and it's going to be fierce. And that is that is what keeps me up at night, to be honest. And I'm not hyperbolizing with being kind of in between research and the actual industry. The amount of abuse that's happening right now, especially with women, that's so dreadful. It's not today, it's not tomorrow, but that shit storm is coming.
Yeah.
And it is going to be awful because for women in particular, how much we mess with our hormones and our reproductive prime impacts how smoothly we can get through perimenopause and also the implications after. If we look at pill use, you don't create progesterone, as I mentioned. What's one implication of that? Bone health. If you were on the pill from, let's say, 18 to 35, and then maybe you had a couple ovulatory periods between 35 and 40, but probably not because you're on the pill for so long that you're going to be hypogonadic. You haven't made and preserved bone. What does that mean for when you're 60? Osteoporosis.
Yeah, not good, right? Yeah.
Not good. And people go like, oh, but I'm strong. I'm an athlete. I'm like, your bone density today is not going to be a determinant of where you are 10 years from now. Sorry, because you might have it now, but you ain't saving.
Yeah, interesting.
That's terrifying to me.
Yeah.
That's so scary. Or the implications for breast cancer, cervical cancer, ovarian cancer, the implications for thyroid issues, the implications for brain. I mean, Alzheimer's and estrogen deficiency. They're like this.
Oh
Yeah.
The implications of multiple sclerosis and fibromyalgia for progesterone deficiency or anovulatory cycles. They're like this. And it doesn't happen when you're 20.
Right.
It's when you're 35 into that 40 range.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it seems like with a lot of the irregularities that come with the cycle, if you're doing your due diligence with health and recovery, you can maybe help alleviate a lot of those irregularities that some people would use the pill for. Is that
some people?
You're right.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So now the people who, and then you say about 5 to 7 years should be a duration if you are on the pill, no more, no less, roughly is what the research shows.
That's what.
Yeah.
I have to be
shoddy
careful
research
because I was
shows.
going to say when there was a little bit more ethics when it came to drugs and some interest wasn't there that is now, there was a lot more discussion of implications and use and guidelines for use than there is now. Okay. So back then, when we still had limited knowledge, that was what was said.
Okay. So that's a rough guideline, 5 to 7 years, very rough. Right. So for someone who's not having irregularities because they are healthy but they don't want to get pregnant, is there a birth control that you would say does the least damage? Like it does blow my mind a little bit that or maybe they have created it, but how can they not create a birth control that aligns with their natural hormonal tendencies of what a regular one? Why does it always have to be synthetic? Or
it's called though basal temperature. There's your answer.
Yeah.
And guess what? You get to learn if you're creating progesterone or not. And you get to have really valuable data for performance. And you get to also learn about your thyroid health. That seems like a win-win situation. And you also get to have a contraceptive that's non-hormonal, non-invasive. It's a no-brainer. Right. And all you have to do is take your temperature first thing in the morning and track it.
So that's it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So
now it doesn't work for everybody. If you have a pre-existing thyroid issue, you do need to actually build some data and figure out if you do have because progesterone is a thermogenic. Your basal temperature is going to increase after you ovulate. And it is actually like incredibly accurate.
Right.
And into conjunction with tracking other signs of menstruation, you can get some incredibly valuable data as to somebody's hormonal levels. I mean, when we're talking about discharge, if you've got an incredibly sticky discharge for too long or at the wrong time in your cycle, that's a sign that something's not going right. We don't get taught that.
No, definitely not. Yeah.
I mean, if you start picking up on things even about when you're having cramping and certain types of cramping, right, that gives you clues as to what's going on. And so these are all things that can not only be helpful from a contraceptive standpoint, but it can also be helpful from a just personal body awareness.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's furthermore, why is it women's role to be in charge of contraceptive? It takes two to tango.
Oh, for sure.
So
for sure.
Condoms are a great alternative. And if you're not somebody that's wanting to go that route, there's also female condoms. There's spermicides. There are other methods there. If we're talking about invasive birth control, the copper IUD often gets kind of put as this like healthy alternative. But the reality is you got copper in your body. That shit's not benign.
Not good.
You start getting issues with copper zinc balance, copper selenium balance. Copper impacts thyroid. Copper impacts other things too when it's too high. Iron, for example. Copper IUD also induces inflammation. That's the way it works. So your rates of cramping are higher. You also start to get some issues with usually estrogen or estradiol in particular, because estradiol and prostaglandins, which are your free fatty acid of sorts, hormone response that happens and causes cramping, they go together. So you've got to manage that. You can manage the copper IUD if you know what you're doing, but most people don't. Right. And even with the copper IUD, you still need to track your basal temperature because you're going to be more likely not to ovulate regularly. And if you don't ovulate regularly, then you're going to have to use a natural bioidentical progesterone to boost up your progesterone levels in a very precise cyclical manner to help counterbalance that estrogen and to help your bones, to help your thyroid. So there are ways to do it. It just takes effort and is not talked about.
Yeah. Interesting. So you're saying that if you're timing that stuff appropriately, right? Because I know I've dealt with a lot of female clients that are estrogen dominant. So we've been trying to find ways to maybe bump up. Is that not a good word either? Fair enough.
So estrogen dominance happens typically, not always, but typically in an environment of low or no progesterone.
That's
so
what
it's
I was
less
say.
about, it's less about estrogen. It's more about progesterone. I use the acronym HELP, high estrogen, low progesterone.
Right. Okay, that's more accurate then. Because I was just about to say that with estrogen dominance is usually low progesterone, or the ratios are so skewed one way or the other. So would you say that if you're trying to fix that with over-the-counter supplements like a liposomal chasteberry or a biswaxin? No, none of that either. Okay, good. So
I start simple.
Okay.
Vitamin D.
Vitamin D. Okay.
Vitamin D is massively important for our reproduction. Zinc. I mean, look at the basic lowest lying fruit here. We've got to make sure individuals are getting the sleep and good sleep. You ain't ovulating if you don't have that. The research on shift work and ovulation, really critical to show that. If you are having issues with food and digestion, you've got to get on top of that. I mean, where do we get our nutrients? How do we get our iron? How do we get our B12? Well, stomach acid. If you're not having adequate levels or an imbalance of stomach acid, well, now you're not getting your nutrients. So in terms of starved state, there you go. So go with the basics. I feel like people come to me and often think that I've got some
magic pill.
Crazy secret, or which I do have some crazy secret stuff of techniques, but those are so far advanced for the everyday person. It's the basic fundamentals. What's needed to help create an ovulatory or healthy environment to promote an ovulatory cycle. From a nutrient standpoint, we've got vitamin D, we've got vitamin A, we've got the Bs, we've got iron, we've got zinc, we've got selenium. So we've got a bunch of our micronutrients in terms of our minerals, our vitamins, our fat solubles. I mean, start there. If you don't fight fire with fire. If you start introducing things like DIM and Shastaberry and all that stuff, you don't even have your basics covered.
Right.
It's like trying to do Ollie and you can't even squat.
Yeah.
So
okay. So if you have those things covered, I'm just curious, do you have to time the progesterone with what the cycle would be? Because that's what it sounded like you were saying.
Yeah. So
if you are trying to increase their progesterone, does it have to be specific durations throughout the month that you are trying to do that, not the entire month?
Typically, like I said, we're not supposed to flatline our hormones. So typically hormone replacement or hormone augmentation should be aligned with a cycle. So cyclical bioidentical progesterone. So oral and topical are not the same thing. They do different things in the body. Oral goes past our blood-brain barrier, actually converts into pregnenolone, converts into GABA. We don't get that same effect when we use topical, and that topical too, depending on where you put it. If you do vaginally, that's going to do different than if you've got it just on your elbow greases. And so with the progesterone itself, cyclical mimics your cycle. If you're doing it straight through, that's not what a natural cycle is for a woman. Just like estradiol, some individuals do need estradiol replacement, but there's a way to do it that's safer for blood clots, that's safer for blood glucose issues. Doing it close, is vaginally is a way to do it. Same thing with androgens for certain individuals. We can use the route of admin and the dosing application methods to be able to actually help with implications of use or side effects, and also make it actually safer, sustainable, and do what we want it to do. So with progesterone itself, it is, either day 14 or day 16 for about 10 days to about 10 days, I would say, is what typically is suggested. And that is a way that you can help to mimic. Now, for individuals that have been severely progesterone deficient for a long ass time or been on the pill, you got to go low and slow, because if not, they are going to go into this like progesterone hypersensitivity, like zombie state.
Yeah.
And so even though typically clinical guidelines are between about 150 to 200 up to 300, I usually will suggest, 25 to 50, to begin, up to 75, and that sometimes even that is too much. And so why you have to prime the body. You got to get the body ready. It's kind of like, that's one of the things why gear can have such a bad name, is people try to push it without getting their foundations in. They try to do the massive, like, holy grail of gear cycles, and they can't shit. That's got implications. Your estrogen gets metabolized and excreted. It will recirculate if you do not have regular bowel movements, men and women. Therefore, we need to make sure we have those fundamentals covered. So you've got an individual who has estrogen dominance and they're constipated. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Work on that first.
Right. Yeah.
We often go so extreme.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, we need to get our foundations covered. You've got somebody who you're considering, say, utilizing a Clomid or Novadex to help them get their, push ovulation forward. And I'm going like, their liver metabolism cycles are messed. They're nutrient deficient. They are having all these signs, such as, like, say, constipation and fatigue and so on and so forth. It's like, let's just get that up and running first and take a step back for 3 months and see where we're at.
Yeah.
Let's do it in a logical way, about, 90 days or so to create that egg cycle. That's 3 months.
Right.
So when you asked me before about, like, how many cycles are, high performance athletes competing a lot, I usually, and this is completely dependent on the individual because it also matters, like, what their past reproductive history was. But I usually say, give me 3 ovulatory cycles before you're an asshole again to yourself. Okay. Whether we're talking about drug use, whether we're talking about high volume training cycles, whether we're talking about competition cycles. And let's plan the meets you do or the events you do with that in mind. If we have to go there, like, I always think John Meadows was one of my mentors. And I remember, like, this is back in like 2010, him being like, sometimes I have to take my clients to a dark place, but I will always get them out of it. And I've saved that tidbit of knowledge. Yeah. And I always say that to myself now too. I'm like, if I have to take you there, I got to land the plane safely after.
Yeah. The darker the place, the more you have to focus on health.
Exactly. Yeah. And I try to be really practical and realistic about this too. You've got somebody who their financial status and livelihood is dependent on their performance. Mm-hmm. Who am I to say no?
You just got to do it the best practice that possible. Yeah.
Yeah. And educate them on what the implications are.
Yeah.
And educate them on what can we do to make sure that we can do this as safely as possible. Right. Men are like, oh, got to go get my labs done. Got to go check my liver values. Got to go do that when they're on gear. And I'm like, where is that knowledge when it comes to women on the pill? That's an oral steroid.
It's not there. Yeah.
I'm literally sitting here and all I'm thinking is like, man, I have it so easy. Like, there are so many things that you mentioned today that I don't think many people have ever considered. They just take this pill and, they're being told, oh yeah, well, you could bleed or you could not bleed. Just take the pill and go on with your life. Not realizing that 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, there were maybe implications that they weren't aware of. Yeah. I want to be mindful of your time. So if you don't have time to answer this question or dive into this, please say so.
I'm good. We've got my partner upstairs has done his podcast for the day. So like I've got the Wi-Fi for right now. So we're good.
Perfect. If you guys haven't checked out Scott's podcasts, they're awesome. So one of the things that I try to put out to anyone who asks me is, in general, the side effects for men who use anabolic steroids are temporary, right? With the exception of perhaps some fertility issues down the road. If I get a better beard, great. If my voice gets deeper, that's fine. But as a woman, if you get a sharper jawline, if you start to develop voice deepening, if you start to develop clitoral enlargement, these are things that, you know, might be permanent. Or maybe I'm wrong.
Yes. No, you're right for some of those. The clitoral one is, a lot of people do get size reduction after going off.
As long as it's recently, not, actually. Yeah.
As long as it's not like chronic use, a lot of women do get a size reduction. Just like certain hormones have different implications for our face shape. So estrogen, for example, is very feminizing for our face shape. So if you were using androgens for a really long time, and then you start using, or then you start creating your normal healthy ebb and flow of hormones, you can get some facial changes through that process. It's more about body fat though. And we also have to be mindful too. It depends on where somebody's at before they begin. It also depends on like hormone levels, and even, and I don't want to go totally off, but like sex is a continuum. Some men have micro penis, some men don't. Some women have reduced clitoral hood, actual tissue. Some women don't. Some women have larger clitoris. So it really depends on what we're starting with. Some women have lower voices. Some women have voice changes due to other factors. I mean, myself included. My voice dropped when my hormones went haywire at 18 when I went off the pill and tried to have my period for the first time. So we have this massive, I mean, we are all so individual. How hormones work in our bodies also depends not just on levels. And this is one of my, like, again, another one of my bones to pick with the industry is that we often go so hyper fixated on levels. And I'm going like, okay, how high or high low something is one piece of the puzzle. But as we've already identified, ratios with other certain hormones are really important. Estrogen, progesterone, receptors are so fucking important, but nobody talks about receptors. Nobody talks about how certain types of receptors will actually cause you can have them influencing your levels depending on that receptor itself. And there is a lot of genetic difference there too. Enzymes that convert. I mean, we think of steroids and how they're created, and often people that are knowledgeable in this area go, okay, steroid genesis, there's this cute little tree. You got DHEA that goes into testosterone. You got testosterone that goes into either like androstenedione, or it goes into estriol, or actually estradiol, then estriol, another axis there. But anyways, it's this cute little tree. That's one version of it. Different places in the body make them differently. Different individuals have different pathways. There's what's called the backdoor androgen production. There's also how we metabolize and convert our hormones, how we transport them. It's complicated. It's really fucking complicated.
Absolutely.
And that's how some individuals can take a shit ton of gear and you're like, how are you still alive? And then you see other people that, female, let's say, that even if it's pure, gets 10 milligrams of Anavar and she's like a mutant all of a sudden. You're like, what the fuck? Right? There are so many different variables at play as to whether or not somebody's going to have short-term implications, long-term implications, the intended effects or the unintended effects. Because at the end of the day, as a female, you are and men alike, but you're inducing a hyperandrogenic state.
Right.
You're inducing a clinical state.
Yeah, for sure.
There are going to be implications for some individuals. And there are going to be implications both short and long term. And even something like hair growth, which people assume happens to all women when they're on androgens. It's like some women are just fucking hairy, but they're good at hiding it to begin with.
Yeah.
Some women don't have that same actual hair follicle sensitivity that others have. So when women ask me, I honestly have to say, I don't know. I can only paint the picture of what could happen, like worst case scenario, and then we work back from there.
Yeah.
Right. It's a great argument for start as low as possible. Right. Because like,
and get your shit together before.
right.
Yeah.
Right. I have that conversation too with, I actually just had a conversation. One of my clients wants to go on TRT and he's speaking to his doctor, and his doctor suggested he start at 100 milligrams a week. And he's like, oh, that seems so low. I'm like, why? If it's too low, he'll tell you, and then you can go up. Right. If you start too high, there's other implications there. 100 milligrams a week is probably going to be better than you feel right now. Or a female is like, oh, I wanted to do my first cycle of Anavar. I think I'm going to take 10 milligrams. I was like, why not start at 5 or 2.5 if you can get small enough pills? Like, why does it have to be this arbitrary number? Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like a lot of the things you're talking about too is just more lifestyle changes and turning over the bigger, more important rocks, which are health, and focusing on getting your body, creating better body awareness for your clients. So that way they can tell you how they're reacting to everything. If they're having digestive issues, you can inform them that having digestive issues could lead to, us telling us that your liver may not be doing something that great. And then we can look at this. Is there anything else like blood work or any other markers that you're looking for as a coach that can give you a broader picture of what those deficiencies might be, so that we can start fixing them before we start thinking about the other things that are more, sexy to talk about, but don't necessarily need to be done until we get those other things fixed?
Yeah. So I have things that are both like more advanced, especially for females that are using, what to watch out for, things to actually that we check on. And then I have things that for like that everyday individual. So when it comes to lab work, I often don't recommend it first off. It's only in certain cases I will.
Interesting.
I start simple.
Yeah.
I start with like, how do you feel? But I do a massive history. I think history is an incredibly important piece of a clinical puzzle that doesn't often get talked about. And even I remember back in the day, like I did my personal training and my certified exercise physiology and all of that stuff. And we would do histories, but we never really got into like, hey, have you had a knee surgery? Because that's going to change how I'm going to program for you.
Right.
Or yeah, let's say, were you a smoker? Yeah, that's going to impact if I'm doing your blood pressure. You gotta know that. So, and I do look at some of those more basic let's call them biofeedback, such as like heart rate and blood pressure and sleep, duration, time, quality. I look at nutrition, not just today, but I want to know your past with it too.
Yeah.
I want to know if you're a female, have you been doing restrictive eating and only just recently started? And are you actually eating what you say you're eating? Because that's another fun thing about lab work, is I can often tell if somebody's doing what they say that they're doing.
Right.
I want to know what type of meds you've been on. I want to know about any family history. I want to know about any implications of, let's say, past illnesses. I want to know even just the basic things. How's your hair? Is it brittle? Are you noticing breakage? Are you noticing any loss? When did that start? I want to know if you've had, let's say, travel to foreign places, and when did your digestive issues start? So I make a timeline.
Yeah.
I look at all of that. When were you a performance athlete? Between what ages? What type of athlete performance or what type of activity were you doing? Were you a gymnast from the time you were 6 to 18 at an elite level? I want to know that.
Weight restricted sports. Yeah. How long you've been doing them for? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And also think about with gymnastics, usually it's a high multi-energy system output. That's going to change how I program for you, not just in terms of health markers, how I have individuals, or, as more of a bodybuilding coach back in the day for growing and helping people with lagging body parts. I wanted to know about that stuff because that's actually how I could tap into and get certain stubborn areas to grow, is by learning from where were you in those fundamental developmental years. That helps me immensely. Yeah. So I think the history is a massive piece that doesn't often get done. I also look at things such as lifestyle. I also look at allocation of resources. So finances, because if I'm programming, especially if I've got to do supplements, I need to know what budgets are. Because I'm not going to be that asshole that gives you $700 a month in supplements and you can barely afford to get your food. Like, let's start with food. Then I also, in terms of when I do get labs, it's very specific. So I need to, for women, I try to time them to the best of my ability. Either, depending on the situation, it's either 2 to 3 days after the start of your bleed. If I am checking to make sure you're making FSH, LH, and estrogen. If I am getting and checking on progesterone, I'm doing it between ovulation and bleed. So usually 5 to 7 days after you ovulate and before you bleed. So in that middle, to see how much progesterone you're making. If I'm actually trying to get a good eye picture of your hormones, we got to do it regularly, because we are dynamic human beings.
Right.
And as women, in particular, since that's what we're talking about, our hormones are fluctuating day to day, week to week. So if I actually want to get a good picture, I have to do markers. One of my biggest pet peeves is when people don't run gonadotropins, so your FSH and your LH. Those are vital to learning about reproduction. When somebody doesn't run the proper thyroid markers. And so I do feel like labs have a place, but we have to put labs in context. Labs don't mean anything unless we put them in context. And so when somebody is in training, I want to know things like sleep. I want to know things like hunger. I want to know things like their training. I don't do training programs for people anymore. I don't do diets for people anymore. And often high performance athletes, they don't have a lot of time to be able to fill out like a monotony of different markers. But just tell me when your high carb day is.
Yeah.
Tell me, because I'll know what your diet approximately probably is. Tell me, are you in a volume cycle? What does that look like? Is that 2 days? Okay, let's try to balance that. It's simple stuff like that. And then it's also learning and building data off of them. I think a really big area that athletic training, exercise physiology, and medicine, we try to fit people into rubrics rather than using science and research to build the scaffolding for us to actually apply that to our individuals. We need to track their markers. We need to learn them and apply the theory, not the other way around.
I like that.
Yeah, that's perfectly said, because so many times coaches are like, this is my theory. You're now my athlete, so you're going to fit into my theory. And it's like, that's the worst and complete opposite way you should approach that.
I get a lot of my high performance athletes to read Speed Trap by Charlie Francis.
Yeah.
So Charlie Francis was Ben Johnson's coach, and people go like, oh, it's because you're a drug researcher. I'm like,
right.
No, it's because Charlie Francis is the GOAT.
Methodical individual, so personally regimented. There's another book that's from 1935 called Swimming in Japan. In Japan, if people know, Cliff Note version of the history, they literally developed sport very quickly and became the best at swimming, overturning the Americans in an astronomically fast period of time. Their coaching methodologies are phenomenal in terms of applying it to the individual, talking about psychology, talking about the social settings, talking about competition versus when they're in high volume versus off season. It is a beautiful illustration of what we should be doing more of, but often coaches don't. When we talk about women in gear use particularly, I get them to look and track for the worst case scenario, because I want to know when that's happening and why that's happening. I will have certain individuals actually even do voice recording. If they don't know where their gear is coming from, and I'm not recommending, I'm merely monitoring the situation. I'm just monitoring. Then it's like, yeah, you've got to record your voice. I'm sorry, but I got to hear if you start to get cracks. I want to know if you start to get a sore throat.
Yeah.
I want to know if you're starting to get sleep apnea, because guess what? If you are, sleep apnea and androgens are like this. They are best friends. And the more that you have sleep apnea, it is going to cause more trauma to larynx that's already dehydrated. Because a big piece of when women's vocal cords, they almost get like taut, they get tight because androgens create rigidity. there are ways around that if you know what you're doing. Those are my secret tricks. I also track for things like hair growth. So I get them to fill out, it's called a Fairman-Galloway scale. And it's used for hyperandrogenism or anovulatory androgen cycles, or PCOS. But I get them to fill it out at the beginning, so I know where we're starting with hair growth. And then also knowing where certain more androgenic hair is more likely to happen. And then tracking that like week to week. Tracking things like bleed and menstrual symptoms and weight and all of that stuff, but also just going, okay, where has research identified, not great research, but identified androgen impacts of high androgens, whether they are from exogenous drugs or endogenous situations. I'm like the eternal cynic, I guess, that I'm like, let's just make sure the worst shit does not happen. But that's the way that we can actually help it not happen.
Right.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Paul, any other questions or?
No, I think that was amazing. I think there's a ton of information. And if anything, I feel as though people will be more likely to ask better questions after a conversation like this, which is all we can hope for.
Yeah, perfect.
Women get your PAPs done. That's another thing. They don't, and that's such an easy way to make sure that everything's okay. Just get a PAP done annually.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much, Victoria. We really appreciate you coming on and breaking your silence of the year with us. On the second podcast. I know, so honored.
So lucky. Yeah.
We don't deserve it, but we're very appreciative of it.
Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, no, our pleasure. And if people want to get a hold of you for any type of consultation, or if they want to follow any of your content or research or anything like that, how can they do that? Or do you not do that?
No, I do, but
okay.
I haven't been on social media in like a year and a half. But I will return one day, and when I do, you'll get all those updates. So follow me anyways, because often my best friend will post for me because she loves me. And my website, that is my hub. Everything is on my website. There's a ton of past podcasts. There are some articles. There are videos. It's contact for consulting. All of that is there. So it's just my first and last name.com. So victoriafelkar.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Victoria. Have a great rest of your week. And thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank you guys for having me.